Hello and welcome to TropeTok. I'm your host, Abby.
I'm Aria.
I'm Rose.
And we have the brilliant Eliza on editing and research. We are a limited series podcast examining and deconstructing common tropes in literature and media. But first, what is a trope? You've very likely heard about tropes before, but just in case you haven't, tropes are common, sometimes stereotypical characters, character arcs, plots, or story types. Say, for example, the jock or the cheerleader characters in high school movies, or the chosen one in fantasy, enemies to lovers, or slow burn in romance. Now, these are not strict delineations. Often similar tropes exist across genres, and they also change over time because as our society changes, so do the stories we tell ourselves. Tropes contain subtextual or not so subtextual implications for readers or viewers. Often they reflect and perpetuate the views and values of the society they function within. For an audience that does not discern this fact, these values are transplanted into their subconscious without them realizing. This is especially the case with young, impressionable audiences. This is why it's so important to engage critically with the media we consume, whether that is books, television, or film, and to recognize these tropes and have a working understanding of where they come from, how and why they are popularly used, and ultimately what values they support or represent. This is TropeTok.
In this episode, we will be focusing on tropes relating to male characters and ideals of masculinity. We will specifically be discussing 1. The bad boy, particularly how it pertains to and manifests in romantic fiction, and how those values reinforce and challenge cultural ideas around masculinity and violence. 2. The action hero lone wolf, again, masculinity and violence, oftentimes canonically justified in the name of protecting or responding to a threat against family. And 3. The nice guy, which typically presents as an alternative to the bad boy love interest in comedies, action movies, and other works. So let's begin our talk.
We want to start off with a trigger warning. We will be discussing some heavier topics, including suicide, rape culture, and misogyny.
So what is the bad boy? Wiktionary defines bad boy, the noun, as a man whose rebellious nature makes him dangerous or attractive. And this definition will be our main focus going forward, but we also want to answer the question of, is that all a bad boy truly is? Now, before we jump into our discussion about bad boys, let's go over a little of the history behind the trope. Bad boys are kind of a hard topic to pin down. There have been so many versions of the trope throughout history, whether that be Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Romeo from Romeo and Juliet, Odysseus from the Odyssey, Lancelot from Arthurian legend, or even the Bible's Lucifer Morningstar himself. There's no shortage of dangerous and attractive men. But one important thing to note is that the bad boy has not always been synonymous with tall, dark, and handsome. Once upon a time, the bad boy was also short, young, and rambunctious. One of the first instances that I was able to come across of a titular bad boy was a novel from 1870 titled The Story of a Bad Boy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Now, the story follows Tom Bailey, who's this young kid, as he runs around town causing a bunch of mischief. In this novel, the worst that Tom gets up to is inciting a snowball fight, and his attempt to, and I quote, revive some old cannons on display in town. The publishing of this novel marks the beginning of amoral and experimental characters in children's literature, something that would evolve into the archetype that we see today. As the bad boy has evolved from what were essentially historical parables and rebellious children's stories into the modern era, now there is an era of indulgence around the trope. Laurel Terulli's paper, Bad Boy Romances, Biker Boys, and Mobster Royalty, notes that bad boys in the romance genre first spiked in 2013, and their numbers have only grown exponentially in the following years. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that throughout all of history, the bad boy in its many forms, ages, and genres has served as a means of enforcing or challenging cultural ideals. The bad boy is bad because he challenges or subverts what is considered goodness, the status quo. But what if that goodness should be challenged, and what are the lines the bad boy shows us that we have? Now, with a little background under our belts, let's jump into the discussion.
So one thing that I found really interesting from the history that you just said, Arya, is that the bad boy genre spiked in 2013. That seems almost too recent. Like, I know that was 11 years ago, which, oh my goodness, but it seems like the bad boy has been around forever.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it has. Like, I just listed some of those examples in early history of like the Odyssey, like Gilgamesh, but I think romantic fiction, the bad boy, what we know today as like that sort of love triangle figure, sort of the temptress almost, who lures the good girl character away from the right side into this sort of moral gray. I think that is pretty recent, especially in those like 2010 era. I can think of so many examples of like the Twilight series, Vampire Diaries. But I do think that it is pretty recent that we have this romantic character who is entirely female gaze focused, of someone the woman wants to get with. I think that is pretty new.
I wonder a lot about how this character manifests in real life and real life relationships that women have. It sets such an unhealthy precedent of what women and young girls really, because a lot of times the consumers of these stories are young girls, like what they should expect and what they should want.
Yeah, I really agree. One of the things that I was looking into when researching this episode of the podcast was this idea of the dark triad in dating. The bad boy being popular in fiction is a relatively new event, especially in the romance genre. But throughout history, there's also been this humanistic trend of people who are attracted romantically and sexually to specifically three traits that are found in the bad boy archetype. These include psychopathy, which is, and by the way, I'm going to explain this very briefly, and you should look this up either on Wikipedia or one of the websites we linked on our website to better understand it. But these traits are psychopathy, which is sort of this lack of remorse for actions, Machiavellism, which I think of more so as the ability to manipulate others, that sort of charismatic, interconnected manipulation. And then also narcissism, which is, it manifests as this sort of magnanimous, super personable, charismatic personality that's also very self-assured. And these are very popular traits. I read a study that went over, I think, 57 different countries, did polling on people who have been in romantic relationships and people who identify with these traits. They didn't necessarily call them these names that I listed, but some of these similar personality traits. And consistently across research, there's been an identified trend of people who possess all three of these dark triad traits being very successful in short-term relationships, and these being very attractive in dating.
And the thing about the bad boy, this, archetype that you described, is that he really does only exist in fiction, because the reality is that if you met someone like that and you did join a relationship, it would very much be what you described. Like, there would be that initial attraction, that initial interest, but then the moment you actually, try to pursue a genuine relationship with them, that veneer just kind of cracks. Like, comes out one of two ways. The first way is that a lot of these characteristics are shallow, and beneath it is a lot of misogyny and insecurity, or worse yet, they're not shallow, but that also means that they tend towards the aspect of psychopathy, or, engaging in relationships because that's the norm, as opposed to doing it because you genuinely care for the other person.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of connection between the presentation of these bad boy traits with real life dating. But I also wanted to go into a little bit of the expanded universe of the bad boy, which I researched into through this paper titled The Bad Boy, A Cultural Phenomenon. And this was an undergraduate journal entry by Chapman University, and it kind of went over some of the ways that we also present the bad boy, not so much as a romantic idealization or a female fantasy, but also just this idea of the bad boy as a figure in culture representing counterculture. So like they define it as a verb to go against. And I think that this definition of the bad boy is a lot more expansive, and I think it does cover a lot of those other aspects of history where you think of like Batman as sort of this roguish, handsome figure who's trying to bend people's morals. But I think this paper is really interesting because it also lists the idea of the bad boy as a liberating figure, or as a rebel who kind of shows us what our conservative nature is. Like, it's the bad boy who goes too far. This idea of pushing what we think of as correct and right and using that as a model of exploration for our societal values, including gender norms, social constructs, and also just social behavior. You see this in a lot of characters.
Those have been some of our thoughts on the bad boy. Obviously, we could quite literally talk about this for hours and hours, and we have, but for the sake of moving on, the next trope that we are discussing is the action hero / lone wolf. So, first, a bit of history. The Cambridge Dictionary defines the action hero character type as the hero of a movie, television show, or sometimes a book who experiences and does a lot of exciting and often violent things. Often, this action hero type of character will also overlap with the lone wolf. These traits combine into a male character who is extremely strong and gruff and believes himself capable of achieving whatever his story requires of him without outside help, reflecting stereotypical heteronormative masculinity. Basically, macho man stuff. The action hero / lone wolf can be found across genres of stories. Think superhero, spy, man versus nature. It is perhaps more predominantly found in cinematic examples such as Indiana Jones, James Bond, John Wick, and Jason Bourne, but there is a long history of spy novels, for example, in which this character trope is also common. In an article tracing the history of the British spy novel, Stafford writes something which can also help us to better understand the phenomenon of characters who belong to this action hero / lone wolf trope. Values are affirmed not only by what members share, but by contrasting them with a set of opposing others outside the group. Thus, symbolic inversions can be a means of highlighting and reaffirming accepted values. The character and behavior of enemy spies in Edwardian fiction, therefore, is of importance in helping to establish and emphasize the value and legitimacy of the gentleman's secret agent. For the purpose of our conversation, let's think about it this way. These action heroes and lone wolves, whether they're cunning spies, powerful superheroes, or other such characters, are themselves representations of stereotypical masculine ideals. In contrast to the bad boy type, which in many cases is tied to romantic stories and the presumably majority female audience, these action heroes are part of literature and media mostly aimed towards men. Some examples include the tradition of spy novels in America and Britain, Mission Impossible, Top Gun Maverick. Reframing the central idea of the earlier quote by Stafford in reference to the action hero trope, that the values are affirmed not only by what members share, but by contrasting with a set of opposing others outside the group, we can see that the action story is a perfect forum for cultural ideas of masculinity to be formed. The action hero must face a villain of some kind, who likely is seen or believed to have failed to measure up to some standard for society. The contrast between the action hero and that villain, then, is just as key to how this trope reflects our concepts of masculinity as the action hero character himself. Within the context of our podcast, we want to explore this character trope as not only the hero specifically of action-based story, but as a representation of and result from what we have upheld culturally and socially as ideals of masculinity. So, let's move to some discussion.
One of the things that I looked at for this discussion was this idea of, so there's a trope, lone wolf, right? This sort of lone character who's either on like the ends of or the outskirts of an organization or group or culture. And with that lone wolf character, there's also this trope of the lone wolf and cub, which actually comes from this Japanese manga, I believe, titled Lone Wolf and Cub, which is this story following a samurai and his infant son as they basically travel around. And it's the first instance that we have in the literary canon of the gruff man protects small child trope, which I think is a really natural pairing with the action hero archetype. So one of the things that I was looking into with this sort of pairing, as we're seeing it more and more, Like a couple examples that I've seen recently, and I love all of them, by the way. I've watched all of them. They're super fun. The Last of Us series that just came out based on the video game with Joel and Ellie. The Witcher, which was a show that I really enjoyed, following Geralt, who's this sort of demon hunter. The Mandalorian. And it's this really interesting blend of enforcing the ideals of masculinity, so like protecting and providing, right? But it also feeds into this sort of female fantasy of male redeemed character who can be part of that family unit. And I also think that it feeds into this sort of male desire for belonging and being needed, which we see rise more and more in these sort of fantasy settings that are coming into question.
That's such a fascinating point about the fantasy of, like, men being a provider. It almost seems like it's a different version of this overall idea of he is being changed by love, whether it is the love of a woman or the love of a child, or like, the love that he feels for a child. It is essentially like he cannot come to this change or this improvement on his own without the outside force.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the role that women and children, I'm throwing women in there, women and children play in the identification of masculinity. There's this concept, I think it's called benevolent sexism,
It is benevolent sexism, I know it.
where it's this idea of women acting as a construct, as a tool to allow for the growth of emotions in men, where it's sort of like they're supposed to act as the other half of the masculine identity. So where the man is hard and strong, the woman is soft and compassionate. And I think that the child in this lone wolf and cub dynamic is actually functioning a little bit in the place of the benevolent woman, allowing the man to grow, to heal, to come to terms with his role in society. So, kind of getting back to this idea of the action hero as a lone wolf, not so much lone wolf and cub, I think that there's a really interesting article written by Toby Miller. It's titled Paradoxical Masculinity by James Bond and the Icon of Failure. And I think that it has this really interesting idea about how these action heroes and lone wolves are held up as a standard of masculinity that sort of sexualizes and objectifies men as well. I think it's a really interesting case study to look at James Bond, specifically this version of him that was very popular. Sean Connery is the actor, and he was James Bond from 1962 to 1983. So one thing to look at for James Bond is this sort of idea of the physical manifestation of masculinity. He's supposed to be this sort of jacked, brooding personality type who's also a body figure. And there were actually US magazines made giving his body measurements. There were entire articles about how to get a body like James Bond. James Bond shows us how a suit should fit. These sort of very close shots of aspects of the masculine body. And I think we see this still in media today with like people wanting to look like bodybuilders, people wanting to look like Wolverine, like Hugh Jackman. And I think that it sort of originated in this hyper masculine space that's sort of evolved and cannibalized itself, whether that be through comics or movies or books. And it's definitely gotten more intense as we have these visual mediums like movies and TV shows where it's constantly on show of like these very buff, brooding, masculine figures.
That's such an interesting point, because a fact that I think a lot of people often don't take into consideration is that the patriarchy also hurts men, that these values of masculinity that are pushed are just as, impossible to reach for men as the values of femininity that are pushed are impossible to reach for women. It really is an across the board kind of problem.
I think that one thing that isn't talked about enough is this idea of the male body as a complex. Think about how their body image is enforced in media. and through their relationships. And I don't have a lot of stats for this. I just have studies that I've collected throughout my years, interviews that I've watched, conversations that I've had. There's a lot of lack for complementary systems for men outside of being that stoic, strong figure that we see in like the action hero context.
And those were some of our thoughts on the action hero / lone wolf. For more information, please check our website.
Okay, kind of rounding out these two character types so heavily associated with our perception of what is masculine, we have something of a foil for this last one. The nice guy is a character type who serves as an alternative to the more traditionally masculine love interest types. He tends to be viewed as more effeminate than his counterparts and by extension as the underdog. Even if he's more or less conventionally attractive, narratives will try to convince us there's something superficial about this man that women don't tend to gravitate towards, that women don't want to date someone who's going to help them out when they need it or that they can lean on for emotional support. That's just someone that they would only ever see as a friend. These characters are under the impression that they treat the female love interest better than the alternatives would, but whatever superficial traits make him undesirable are the reason she won't go out with him, or the fact that their friends proclaiming himself to be in the friend zone, which we'll talk about in a minute, or that she wants someone who's going to treat her poorly and therefore won't look twice at our nice guy protagonist. Because he so strongly holds these ideas of both being better than the more stereotypically masculine love interest and having this overlooked, he thinks he's more deserving of the object of his desire. He also believes that with persistence, she'll eventually come around and realize this. This shows a strong sense of entitlement on his part, thinking he knows what's best for her and that she should listen to him, and assuming a flaw in character on her part when she rejects him. In a master's thesis on the subject, Ingeborg Hien-Nerspa listed examples of this trope appearing in classic literature before pointing out that it really rose to prominence in 1980s movies, particularly romantic comedies. She also points out that due to the nature of the genre, the nice guy, though he treats the love interest in not great ways, ultimately gets what he wants in the end, usually ending up with the object of his affection after all of his persistence. The existence of the nice guy, and particularly the fact that he gets to win in the end, contribute to issues in the real world, like rape culture, telling men that if they just keep trying, eventually the no will turn into a yes. Nesba also points out that he adheres to traditional views of masculinity more than he seems to think he does. Sure, he's less athletically inclined than his counterparts, and at least in his mind views women as people that he could befriend. He's still more or less stoic and unemotional, the way that men are expected to be. She also points out that he can be even more stoic than other male characters, as a big part of his, maybe stoic isn't the right word, but like less open with his emotions than other male characters. As a big part of what defines this trope is the fact that he's concealing something in the true reason he's befriending the pretty lady character. While this trope was very prominent for a few decades, we seem to be moving in something of a commentary direction with it. This may be more something with the media I consume more than anything else, but the example that comes to mind that fits this character type is Tom from 500 Days of Summer, a film highlighting the issues with this character. The way this movie aimed to subvert the trope was having it end in a way that makes it so that he doesn't get the girl in the end. Tom is persistent in his pursuit of Summer in a way that is typical of this trope, but she ultimately doesn't want to be with him, ending up married by the end of the movie to someone who we never see. Tom's characterization over the course of the movie is also meant to show that he's not someone we're supposed to sympathize with. He's shown as violent, being introduced throwing plates in his anger, and there are two scenes that mirror each other where one where he talks about the list of reasons he loves Summer. Also, this is only tangentially relevant, but her knees are weirdly high on that list. And the same scene with the same list, only this time it's the reasons he dislikes her once she rejects him. This shows that the nice guy's love is very much conditional, once again bleeding into real life, with the friend zone being a real life phenomenon. Plenty of women have stories about men that they believe to be their friends who turned out to only have befriended them in the interest of dating them. Unfortunately, people also misinterpreted this movie, reading Summer as the villain, as opposed to the victim. Ultimately, this trope highlights male entitlement even when they're viewed or feel they are viewed as adhering less to traditional gender roles. And yeah.
So I'm really glad that you brought up 500 Days of Summer, because the way that it's been discussed often is not usually in terms of Tom being a nice guy, and I'd never thought of it that way, even though it does make perfect sense. Usually it's considered a subversion of the manic pixie dream girl, as like she is his manic pixie dream girl, except she almost insists on her own personhood, refusing to fall into the she came in and fixed his life category, and instead doesn't. So I really like that. Another film that comes to mind for me, and I think the nice guy in particular is a trope that we'll see more in film and television rather than in literature, because ultimately you would not be able to paint the nice guy as a sympathetic character in literature if you had his internal monologue, because then you would just be hearing his thoughts and his intentions, and all of a sudden you see the the contradiction between his actions and what he's actually thinking, what he's trying to achieve.
I actually want to push back against that idea a little bit because we do have examples in the genre, not so much of romance, but of horror and thriller. I think a good modern example that is pretty popular in television today is You on Netflix, which follows basically a stalker serial killer who has these very internal nice guy monologues, constantly talking about how his behavior is the most benevolent for the girl he's pursuing, and also relating his self-identity as more important or more masculine and traditionally nice guy isn't the unofficial term than the other interests of romantic pursuit for this girl. I think that not so much in romance, but in horror, it is a pretty explored genre.
But exactly, that's what I mean. When you hear the nice guy, in horror, in thriller, I think at this point in time, culturally, we are more aware of the fact that this character type is dangerous and that these thought patterns are dangerous, but there is still a litany of movies and television shows where the nice guy is just that. He's still perceived as being nice. He's still rewarded getting the girl. Think Ross from Friends, for example. No one ever calls him out for his, quite frankly, sometimes misogynistic behavior.
Yeah, I was reading a study on online dating, and it was talking about the tendencies of men versus women in achieving dates and how that reflects on the mental health of both groups. And one of the things that they were actually studying was the likelihood of being reciprocated through online dating profiles and how that contributes to male mental health. One of the things that they pointed out in the study is that out of every, so they call them pursuits. Say like you message someone for the first time on Tinder, you message them on some sort of matching website. The likelihood of men being responded to is almost, I think, half as if women are the pursuer. There is a large difference in weight in terms of the dating market, which does in some ways contribute to who feels they have social capital in dating. So women tend to feel like they have more power in choosing dates than men, even though men are more likely to initiate conversations with women or people that they're romantically interested in. And there's also this idea of, because of this lack of empowerment, being chased constantly as a woman, constantly being pursued, which does tie up in this sort of emergence of the nice guy as a horror trope, specifically from women's perspectives in women authored media, versus that sort of nice guy as the attempting, constantly friend-zoned, I don't know if that's a good verb, character in men's perspective media.
Have any of you watched Promising Young Woman?
No.
I haven't.
It it is a movie that puts into perspective this concept of the nice guy so well. It is essentially, I don't want to spoil, but it's essentially this woman, she one of her very close friends, someone she loved, was date raped or roofied, like one of those, and she ended up taking her life. And now this woman, our main character, is still very much like deeply in grief. And the way that she deals with that grief is she intentionally will go to bars and pretend to be extremely drunk, like, like sloppy, whatever, even though she's stone cold sober, to see the way men behave around her. And you just consistently will see these men come up to her under the guise of the nice guy, being like, oh, are you okay? Let me take care of you. And what they will always instead do is they'll take her back to their own house, and they will try. And then at that point, she'll, all of a sudden be stone cold sober. And she's like, what are you trying to do? And often these men feel, I don't know if it would be shame exactly, but, just this idea of getting caught. Because deep down, I think when you're doing something wrong, when you have someone in that state and you're attempting to take advantage of them, you know it. But the ending of the movie is the thing that really, really gets you, because it seems like such an empowering idea, right? But at the end of the movie, she actually ends up dying, because in her pursuit of justice, she is killed. And it is only because of her death that the man who murders her, who happens to be the same one who raped her friend, goes to prison. So even though she wins, ultimately she doesn't. He gets punished, but what's the point? She's already lost her life.
I think one good example of the nice guy is sort of these double tropes of both being a pursuing and cruel character versus the entitled character versus a genuine nice guy. I think a pretty good popular example of this trope is in the series Harry Potter. The difference between Severus Snape and Remus Lupin, who are both presented as this sort of nice guy character, but in very different ways. So Severus Snape is the nice guy in the sense of, and this is mostly through the retelling of the movie, a character who is nice in the hope of getting into a romantic relationship with the main character's mother, Lily. But once he is rejected from his advances, turns into this sort of vengeful, grouchy, child-punishing character who is more so, I think, in line with this idea of the nice guy that we see today in incel culture. But there's also an example of the character Remus Lupin in the series who is legitimately just the nice guy. He ends up in a relationship with Nymphadora Tonks. They have a child together, and he does so not because he is constantly vying for her attention, always the gentleman, but because he's just genuinely a pretty nice person. He gives people chocolate. He interacts with his students on a one-to-one basis. He embodies a lot of the things that I think masculinity in this sense are trying to be. And I think that looking at these two as a study is a very interesting case on the idea of entitlement in masculinity.
I love that you said that, because it describes it perfectly, the entitlements. Because ultimately the difference between these like fake nice guys and actual nice guys is that, the Snape type of nice guy is nice in the hopes of gaining a reward. It's the entitlement of, I deserve this because I am nice, because I am treating someone with basic human decency. They should now give me what I want, as opposed to someone who's just genuinely a good person who just does it for the base value of goodness.
Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to reiterate from Rose's introduction was this idea that presenting these different models of nice guy narrative, specifically having the unironic nice guy who gets the girl because of his devotion, loyalty, and the knowledge that he wants the girl all along, having these tropes present in media, I think is very harmful in the raising of and culturing of young men in particular, and also young women, because as Rose put it, it naturalizes and normalizes this idea of desire as entitlement.
Okay, thank you so much for listening. That was our first episode. If you have any thoughts, comments, concerns, please feel free. Thank you. We are TropeTok.